Okay, so today we're going to dive into a situation that's been making headlines and causing a lot of concern.
Yeah.
It's about religious minorities in South Asia and specifically the Hindu community in Bangladesh.
Right.
This isn't, just a fleeting news story.
Hmm.
This is something deeply rooted in the history of the region and the ongoing geopolitical realities there. And it's something that has become, I guess, even more urgent to talk about after the deposition of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh last August.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sadly, that event coincided with a spike in violence targeting Hindus.
Absolutely. I mean, when
Yeah.
we look at what's been happening in Bangladesh, and we kind of put that in the context of what minorities in Pakistan have been experiencing as well, it paints a very, very troubling picture.
Yeah.
And, many people are even saying that this is perhaps the lowest point for religious minorities in the subcontinent since, that whole tumultuous period of the 1947 partition. Yeah. It's a pretty stark reminder that those intended resolutions of that historical event,
Yeah.
they remain incomplete.
Yeah.
And they continue to cast a really long shadow on the region.
It's so true. And, speaking of partition in 1947, I mean, the whole idea behind it was to resolve the Hindu-Muslim question, right?
Right, exactly.
But it seems like the outcome has been something quite different.
Yeah, I mean, as it's often the case with these, grand geopolitical plans, the reality on the ground was just far more complex and, to be honest, tragic.
Yeah.
Instead of neatly resolving the Hindu-Muslim question, partition kind of ended up redrawing the lines of division in a way.
Yeah.
And it created these new and very enduring geopolitical and social fault lines.
Yeah.
And those continue to generate tension even to this day.
Right.
I mean, just think about it. The very act of, dividing a shared land and uprooting millions of people, I mean, that leaves deep and lasting scars on the collective psyche of an entire subcontinent.
Absolutely. And you're saying that those scars have had a really long-term impact? I mean, shaping national identities, even fueling these ongoing disputes between these nations.
Precisely. The way that partition was managed, the political and administrative structures that kind of emerged in both India and Pakistan,
Yeah.
they've profoundly influenced how these nations view themselves
Yeah.
and their relationships with each other. And here's where it gets really interesting. When we consider the rise of what we now call hegemonic Hindutva nationalism in India,
Right.
this dominant form of Hindu nationalism that often seeks to, assert cultural and political primacy,
Yeah.
the trauma and widespread displacement that Hindu migrants experienced during partition that played a significant role in the growth of this ideology.
Wow.
It acts as a kind of collective memory that's still shaping political thought today.
That's fascinating how a historical event like that can shape present-day ideologies.
Yeah.
And it's also important to remember that, partition wasn't just about Hindus and Muslims.
Oh, absolutely not.
It had a huge impact on other communities as well.
While that Hindu-Muslim dynamic was definitely, central to the rationale behind partitions, its consequences really rippled outward.
Yeah.
And they significantly affected Sikhs, Christians, and various other minority groups who suddenly found themselves, on the wrong side of these newly drawn borders.
Right.
And then you have the creation of Pakistan, which introduced new socio-political categories like the Mohajirs.
The Mohajir.
Yeah, Urdu-speaking migrants from India.
Yeah.
And this further complicated the already very intricate minority landscape in Pakistan.
Right.
And then with the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, which was founded partly on, linguistic and cultural identity, we see another layer of complexity added to the regional minority question.
Yeah.
So it really underscores that this issue of minority rights and experiences isn't just a bilateral concern between India and Pakistan.
Right.
It's a fundamental issue that impacts regional stability as a whole.
So in the immediate aftermath of partition, what were some of the primary concerns regarding these newly formed minorities in both India and Pakistan, especially given that, we saw this immense human displacement?
Well, I mean, the immediate and honestly the most overwhelming concern was just the sheer scale of displacement.
Yeah.
Millions of people were forced to migrate, leading to just unimaginable human suffering. And it raised serious fears about the security and the future of those who either chose to remain or couldn't leave, on the quote-unquote wrong side of the border.
Yeah.
There were even discussions among prominent Indian leaders like figures like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and B.C. Roy.
Right.
They were talking about this grim possibility of a complete population exchange.
Wow.
Essentially formalizing the forced migrations that were already tragically underway.
That's a chilling thought, a complete population exchange. And you mentioned Sardar Patel, a key figure in India's independence movement. even advocating for military intervention in what was then East Pakistan to secure land for Hindu refugees. That really underscores the level of urgency and anxiety felt at the time.
It absolutely does. It highlights the deep anxiety and the perceived vulnerability of the Hindu minority in East Pakistan from the very beginning.
Right from the start.
Yeah. And I think that historical context is so crucial for understanding the events that unfolded later. Now, one of the early attempts to address these concerns and establish some kind of framework for peaceful coexistence was the 1950 Nehru-Liaquat Ali Pact.
The Nehru-Liaquat Ali Pact.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that this agreement aimed to provide a bilateral framework for the protection of minority rights in both India and Pakistan.
Okay.
They were hoping to prevent further conflict and ensure at least a basic level of security and rights for those who had stayed behind after partition.
And how was this pact received when it was first introduced?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, it was met with some positive commentary in some Pakistani media outlets, notably in the Dawn newspaper, which viewed it as a significant step towards stability and protecting minority communities. However, in practice, its effectiveness, particularly in East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, proved to be quite limited.
I see.
It ultimately failed to prevent the continued marginalization and persecution of Bengali Muslims in East Pakistan.
Right.
Which, as we know, played a critical role in the lead-up to Bangladesh's independence in 1971.
So in a way, the very creation of Bangladesh exposed the inherent limitations and the incompleteness of the two-nation theory, which was, based on religious identity.
Precisely. The emergence of Bangladesh as an independent nation founded not solely on religion, but also on shared language and cultural heritage, really demonstrated that the Hindu-Muslim binary that partition was based on was just too simplistic.
Right.
It was insufficient to encompass the complex realities of the region.
Yeah.
And so the subcontinent fractured into three distinct nations, each grappling with its own unique and evolving set of minority challenges.
Which brings us to the specific and concerning case of Hindu minorities in Bangladesh. At the time of Bangladesh's hard-won independence in 1971, what was the status and position of the Hindu community there?
Well, at that point, Hindu citizens were a significant portion of Bangladesh's population.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that a large number of Hindus had actively participated in and supported the Mukti Bahini.
The Mukti Bahini.
Yes, the liberation forces in their struggle for independence from Pakistan.
Okay.
So they were generally viewed as allies by India. And there was perhaps an initial sense of hope and optimism regarding their place in this newly formed nation.
But that initial optimism seems to have faded over the decades.
Unfortunately, yes.
And we've witnessed this consistent and really troubling decline in the Hindu population in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
What are the primary factors driving this demographic shift?
Well, it's a combination of really disturbing factors. Reports and analyses point to this persistent pattern of violence targeting the Hindu community, including physical assaults, forced conversions to Islam, and the widespread and often illegal seizure of land and property.
It's terrible.
All of these things have created this pervasive sense of insecurity and vulnerability among Bangladeshi Hindus, and many feel compelled to migrate to India in search of safety.
And you specifically mentioned land seizures.
Yes.
And I remember reading about the Vested Property Act, which has really exacerbated this problem.
Yeah, the Vested Property Act is a really problematic piece of legislation with deep historical roots. It was originally enacted in Pakistan as the Enemy Property Act during the 1965 war with India.
Yeah.
And it was unfortunately retained in Bangladesh after its independence.
Okay.
Essentially, it grants the state the authority to confiscate properties belonging to individuals deemed to have left the country.
Wow.
And in practice, this law has disproportionately and unjustly affected the Hindu minority.
Right.
Many Hindus fled during periods of conflict or because of a well-founded fear of persecution. And this Vested Property Act has become a major instrument of economic marginalization.
Yeah.
Basically dispossessing countless Hindu families of their ancestral lands and livelihoods.
And is there a pattern to the violence itself? Are there certain triggers or times when this violence against Hindus tends to escalate?
Sadly, yes. Data and reports suggest that the violence often intensifies during politically sensitive periods, like national elections.
Okay.
And we also see these spikes in violence as a reaction to events in India that some groups in Bangladesh perceive as negatively impacting Muslim sentiments.
Interesting.
So this highlights a dangerous interconnectedness and a vulnerability to cross-border tensions and political opportunism.
Which leads us to the recent events, the deposition of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina in August of last year,
Right.
and the subsequent rise in concerns for the safety of the Hindu minority. Her government was generally perceived as being more sympathetic to minority rights and more committed to communal harmony, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, while Sheikh Hasina's Awami League government definitely had its critics,
Sure.
they generally did try to maintain communal harmony and at least publicly showed a commitment to protecting minority rights.
Oh,
So her removal from power has triggered significant fears within the Hindu community and among human rights observers.
of course.
There's a concern that this shift could embolden Islamist and hardline nationalist groups who might not prioritize the rights and well-being of religious minorities.
Right. So what do you see as the underlying motivations behind this violence and discrimination? Is it politically motivated, a tool for destabilization by opposition forces, or is it something more systemic, a more pervasive form of persecution?
That's a tough question.
Mm.
And honestly, it's probably a complex mix of both.
Okay,
There's evidence that some attacks on Hindus are politically orchestrated,
I see.
potentially used by opposition groups or extremist elements to sow discord, create instability, and undermine the government.
Right.
But there's also a deeper issue of societal discrimination that makes the Hindu community a recurring target.
So it's a combination of factors.
Disentangling these motivations is crucial for finding effective and long-term solutions to this problem.
Now let's talk about India's role in this. Traditionally, India has had a strong and supportive relationship with Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League. Why is that?
Well, India's support for Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League stems from their relatively secular political stance
Okay.
and their willingness to cooperate with India on strategically important issues like counterterrorism and regional connectivity.
Right.
From India's perspective, having a stable and friendly government in Bangladesh led by the Awami League has been beneficial for their own security and regional interests.
But there's been some criticism that India's approach has been too focused on this one political relationship.
Yeah, there's a growing debate that India might have made a mistake by relying too heavily on the Awami League and neglecting to build relationships with other parts of Bangladeshi society, like civil society organizations, democratic institutions, and other political groups beyond the ruling party.
I see.
They argue that India needs a more diversified approach.
Then what are the risks for India if they continue with this narrow focus?
The main risk is that if there's a big shift in Bangladesh's political landscape,
Yeah, okay.
say a new government with a different ideology comes to power,
Yeah.
India could find themselves in a tough spot.
How so?
They might have lost influence and lack connections with the new leadership.
That makes sense.
By not investing in a wider network of relationships across Bangladeshi society,
Uh-huh.
India could be caught off guard
Right.
and struggle to maintain their strategic interests in the region.
So looking ahead, what should India's approach to Bangladesh be? How can they navigate this complex situation and also contribute to the well-being of minorities in Bangladesh?
Well, it seems like India needs to recalibrate their approach.
Okay.
They need to move beyond an almost exclusive focus on the Awami League
Right.
and actively work to build stronger ties with a wider range of Bangladeshi society.
Okay.
This means fostering stronger connections with civil society organizations,
Yeah.
reinforcing engagement with democratic institutions,
Mm-hmm.
and cultivating relationships with various regional political groups.
So a more multifaceted approach.
Exactly. This would lead to a more resilient and stable bilateral relationship.
One that's not so dependent on any one political party.
Right. And beyond the India-Bangladesh relationship, India needs to think about their broader stance on minority rights across South Asia.
That's a great point.
They need to adopt a consistent and principled stance on protecting minority rights across the entire region.
I agree.
If India is seen as only advocating for Hindus in Bangladesh while overlooking concerns about Muslims and other minorities within their own borders,
Yeah.
it risks being perceived as hypocritical.
Right.
And that could fuel further religion polarization in the region and damage India's credibility on these issues.
So the key takeaway for our listeners today, especially those preparing for their UPSC exams, is that the situation for religious minorities in South Asia, particularly the Hindu community in Bangladesh, is incredibly complex. It has deep historical roots going all the way back to partition. And it's still being shaped by the political dynamics within Bangladesh, the geopolitical relationships in the region, and India's strategic choices. Understanding these connections is crucial for both the mains and prelims exams.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that what happens to minorities in one part of South Asia is connected to what happens to minorities in other parts.
Yeah.
We can't view these issues in isolation.
It really highlights the need for more inclusive approaches to governance across the region.
Yes.
And a stronger commitment to protecting the rights and security of all minority communities. That's essential for long-term stability and a more harmonious future for everyone.
So this brings up a question for you, our listener. Given this historical context and the current political trends, what do you think are the most effective long-term strategies for creating genuine inclusivity and ensuring lasting security for religious minorities across the subcontinent? What role can international actors and civil society organizations play in tackling this challenge?
This deep dive was informed by some really insightful analysis from The Hindu. If you found this discussion helpful, especially for your UPSC prep, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment with any questions or thoughts you have. We really appreciate your engagement, and we're committed to continuing these important conversations.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.